Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope that you're safe and very healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a virtual conversation about issues of critical importance both to America and to the world. Well, here we go again. Perhaps in a country where the average survival of a government since independence was roughly 2.3 years, we should expect a certain amount of dysfunction and disruption in Israeli politics. And I recall Henry Kissinger's quip, made half in jest, that Israel had no foreign policy, just domestic politics. But by any standard, certainly by those of the 22 countries Freedom House has identified that have maintained their democratic character continuously since 1950, 4 elections and the very real prospect of a 5th has got to be a first among democratic polities. In fact, in one of his better lines, Joe Biden's predecessor quipped after Israel's second election, Israelis seem to have a lot of elections, but nobody seems to win. And it appears today as if we may be at yet another impasse, looking at the possibility of yet another trip to the polls, perhaps late summer, perhaps September. Still, before we can reach that conclusion, weeks, if not a month or so, of coalition politics and maneuvering lie ahead. And who knows, in the spirit of the Jewish Passover, the question of why is this election different from all the others may actually produce a relevant and different answer. So, to what or perhaps to whom do we attribute this wash, rinse, and repeat cycle? Is it structurally driven, or is it a direct function of a certain prime minister's legal travails, or is it both, or is it even more complicated? Are there obvious winners and losers to date, apart from the issue of government formation? What are the most likely paths for a pro-Netanyahu bloc or an anti-Netanyahu bloc to form a government? And what is the best news to come out of this election? And conversely, what is the worst news? And if, in fact, there were to be a government that isn't headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, what would its foreign policy look like? How would it differ? And finally, is electoral reform of the Israeli political system remotely possible? Our Constitution has been amended 27 times in 240 plus years, and 10 of those amendments came in a single blow. So the real question is it possible to fundamentally change the nature of a political system? Fortunately, as usual, I don't have to answer any of these questions, at least not today, but I know 3 extraordinary humans who can. Daniel Kurtzer is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. During a 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Ambassador Kurtzer served as the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt. He was also a speechwriter and member of Secretary of State George P. Shultz's policy planning staff, and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. Natan Sachs is the director of the Brookings Institution's Center for Middle East Policy in Washington. He publishes widely on Middle Eastern affairs, Israel's foreign policy, and Israeli domestic politics, and is a frequent media commentator on these issues. Sachs has taught at Georgetown and was a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford University, a visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University's Dayan Center, and a Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia. He holds a BA from the Amiram Honors Program at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and an MA and a PhD in political science from Stanford University. And finally, Dahlia Scheindlin is a public opinion expert and strategic consultant with 20 years of experience, specialized and progressive social causes. She has advised 8 national campaigns in Israel and worked in 15 other countries. Scheindlin conducts research and policy analysis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, regional foreign policy in the Middle East, democracy, human rights and civil rights, minority issues, religion and state, domestic political analysis, comparative conflict, and comparative politics. She's currently a fellow at the Century Foundation and co-hosts the Tel Aviv Review podcast. And during the current elections, she co-hosted the Election Overdose podcast at the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. The format is by now known to all of you. 5 minutes or so of opening presentations, an annoying round of questions from me, and some Q&A from the audience. Dahlia, would you honor us by beginning? I'm going to cede the virtual space to you, and thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for hosting me and for setting me up for the challenge, which I'm bound to fail, of explaining Israeli elections. I want to start out with the basic narrative that has come out of this election, that it's all about Netanyahu. It's all about whether people are for or against Bibi. And the results of the last 4 election cycles certainly seem to support that, because the most constant thing about them, everything else has changed, the political parties, the nature of party leadership has all changed, but the most constant thing is how the blocs for and against Netanyahu broke down pretty much evenly. Each time Netanyahu failed to receive the much hoped for 61, the majority that would give him a coalition. The first time he got 60. I don't really count the first time, because at that time, nobody knew that the right-wing party headed by Avigdor Lieberman would not join his government. But all 3 times after that, he got 55, then 58, then 59. No real change in that breakdown. The opposition, or the parties opposed to Netanyahu, each time got a majority and failed to form a government. The other indicator or reason why people might think that this is all about Netanyahu is because in this election, this is one of the things that is different in this cycle relative to pretty much any other cycle, is that 72 out of 120 parliamentary seats went to right-wing parties, ideologically right-wing parties. That's because the pro or anti-Netanyahu sentiment split the right, causing Gideon Sa'ar to break away from Likud and form a challenger party, of course, Avigdor Lieberman's party, and that drew in some right-wingers, but also centrists, leading to the most right-wing Knesset, as far as my memory goes back. Certainly, I've counted up those numbers over the last 20-odd years, and I think before that, it's a safe bet that 72 is the highest number. So it looks like, the for or against Netanyahu is the defining feature. Of course, those opposition parties can't form a coalition together. But the reason why they can't form a coalition together is where we need to go deeper. I think the narrative of Netanyahu misses or obscures a very deep set of ideological divisions, really reaching into people's worldviews that shape Israeli society, that are often, fundamentally at odds with one another. And we don't have time to go into all of them, but I will just point out what I think are the 3 overriding axes of divisions in Israeli life. The first and towering one is attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It doesn't have to be in campaign advertisements to be, part of the background about how every Israeli chooses a party on the left, right, or center. The next most divisive issue is religion and state. And increasingly, the biggest dividing line on the Israeli agenda today is attitudes towards democratic institutions, particularly the Israeli judiciary, the independence of the Israeli judiciary, or, as the right wing believes, the need for greater political control. Now, there's a host of other policy issues that are on the agenda, but most of them really fall into one of those 3 categories. And I want to argue that we can tell that those issues really matter because of what exactly changed in the results of this election. The main thing that we see that's different this time is that those 2 big challenger parties, Likud and whatever the challenger party was, blue and white in the first 3 elections, and then the sort of centrist parties that inherited the voters of blue and white, they didn't do very well. Likud lost went down from 36 to 30 seats, so lost 6 seats in these elections. Blue and white, of course, went from 33 seats to arguably 25 seats, because 17 went to Yair Lapid's center-leaning left party, and 8 went to blue and white. But all the remainder of those votes went to parties on the ideological further edges. So Labor and Meretz party, who ran together in the previous elections, went up 6 seats in their combined vote. On the other side, and I am not creating a moral equivalency, but on the right-wing side of the divide, the Religious Zionism Party, which didn't exist before, or when those parties ran separately, they never crossed the electoral threshold, went from 0 to 6. So it's not exactly a 1-for-1. They also took from the ultra-Orthodox votes. But the fact is that I think Israeli voters, those people who had voted for big parties in the middle, realized that it wasn't satisfying or fulfilling, and they certainly didn't get what they wanted by voting strategically for big parties. And they decided to go back to the parties that reflect their ideologies by choosing those parties further, who are more committed to their ideological issues. Now, if anybody needs more evidence, I think the post-election discussions are kind of the last piece of evidence that there is a lot of ideology at play here. Already before the elections, Naftali Bennett and his party Yamina, who have been considered part of Netanyahu's bloc up until now, but who played coy during the elections about whether he would form a coalition with Netanyahu or not, he made very strong statements ahead of the elections that he would not go into a government led by Yair Lapid. Why? Well, some might say ego, but I'm not that cynical. I think that he was trying to stake out his position as a right-wing leader, because that's what he said over and over again. The country's right wing, I won't sit under a center-left prime minister. And other people in the right-wing camp basically argue the same thing. Now we see that although there are conversations, the last thing that happened was Gideon Saar's breakaway from Likud party, basically has a sort of tentative alliance with Bennett, probably saying the same thing. He won't go into Lapid's government if Bennett doesn't go in. So at this point, the main reason, and this goes back to the first three cycles, the main reason those parties in the opposition or the change camp, whatever you want to call them, cannot form a government together is because they are, heavily invested in their deeply contradictory views of Israeli society. So I think that it does a disservice to the voters to look at this as if it's all about Netanyahu. Netanyahu simply has come to stand for whole sets of worldviews that are not aligned. And that's why we see the challenge of forming an opposition government completely stuck. They could get it together. And I'll just end by saying that my, pre-election prediction was 40% chance Netanyahu would form the next government, 30% an opposition government, 30% new elections. And nothing's really changed except that I might have rotated the 30% options. So I'll stop there. One last thing. If there is to be an opposition government, for the reasons I said, if there is a government with all of these disparate parties, it could very easily be a sort of sick man of Israel kind of government and become dysfunctional very fast. And then we might find ourselves in a fifth election anyway. Thank you.
Assertion that essentially, to borrow a trope from Seinfeld, that these elections are not shows about nothing. They actually reflect deep ideological divisions, and the fact that the change camp can't get it together to form a unified, coherent opposition is largely because they're ideologically a hodgepodge of parties that have a very difficult time sitting together, with the exception, perhaps, with the purpose of getting rid of Mr. Netanyahu. Fascinating. Natan Sachs, can I turn it over to you?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and it's really an honor to speak alongside two luminaries. I'll start by slightly disagreeing with Dahlia. I agree on in the main, but slightly differ, and then touch quickly on the question of foreign policy, but especially about electoral reform. Dahlia points very well, I think, to the three main cleavages of Israeli society, and exactly point to the Achilles heel of what's known now as the change bloc, which for every single one of these cycles has failed to take upon, except for the first, I suppose, failed to take upon the possibility of forming an alternative government, precisely because it is so extremely fractured on these different ideological issues. And ideology, bigotry, tribal emotions that exist in any society, all these things, of course, play a very important role. The reason Benny Gantz is not prime minister right now, for example, is very simple. The right flank of his own party would not only not sit together with the Joint Arab List, but would not accept outside support from the Joint Arab List, or at least the main parts of it, to form a government of their own. And some of them are still players. Some of them are now in Gideon Saar's party and in other places, but they again prevent the possibility, probably, of a coalition of the sort of change coalition. If we saw a coalition by someone else, led by someone else besides Netanyahu, it would necessarily not only include clearly right-wing parties, some of them in the change bloc of Avigdor Lieberman, Gideon Saar. It would also almost necessarily include Naftali Bennett. And I would not be surprised that if they succeed, which is unlikely, but if they succeed, they would have pulled away an ultra-Orthodox party or two from Bibi's camp, thereby allowing them to have a sort of coherent coalition, still one that would not last for very long. So where do I disagree? I disagree in the fact that the main cleavage between the two camps, the thing that defines the two camps, the reason that we have these right-wing parties in the change camp to begin with, is about Netanyahu. So the reason that Netanyahu's camp could form, of course, a coalition, they are more coherent on all of these three dimensions that Dahlia mentioned. But the reason that we have not just one or two, but now really 2.5 significant parties that are right-wing, clearly right-wing, on our traditional dimensions in the change camp has to do with Netanyahu. But it's not simply with him, the individual. He is, of course, not. He has been prime minister longer than anyone in Israel. And he had all these figures, including many others, in his coalitions in the past. It is, at the end of the day, about his legal trouble. And I mean that in two senses. One is that gives at least political cover for people to break with him. There's also a lot of personal issues. Lieberman and Netanyahu probably have nothing to do with the legal issues. Lieberman has personal beef with Netanyahu. But it also means that Netanyahu himself is much more in need of his position. He sees his position as prime minister not only due to perhaps a Messiah complex, thinking that no one can replace him, which we know the graveyards are full of those, but also because he believes, perhaps correctly, that his best chance of getting out of legal trouble is via manipulating the legal system. In another case, if there were a prime minister indicted and failing to win now 4 rounds, he would simply have stepped aside. And what would have happened the day after is a very quick and rather coherent coalition led by his own party, the Likud, together with big chunks of the change bloc that would have jumped in easily. Lieberman, Sao, of course, is from the Likud. He wanted to be that person himself. And I would not rule out at all that Lapid or others would have joined gladly as well. A quick point about electoral reform. This is, of course, extremely abnormal. Israel, before 2016, everyone would always ask people like us, why is Israeli politics so crazy? Then they stopped in 2016. Now they've started again. Israeli politics are mostly not crazy, but obviously something is broken, and it's not just about Netanyahu, the individual. There is the possibility of change. Changing the constitution, which doesn't really exist as a constitution in Israel, is much easier. Netanyahu and Gantz just did it so as to manipulate a new coalition themselves. It can be done. It was unlikely because in the 1990s, Israel did this. In fact, Netanyahu was the deciding vote then, breaking with his own Likud party to pass electoral reform. That is considered to have failed, whether or not it did. And so once you try and fail, of course, it's much harder to do things again. Still, I think that this debacle of the last 2 years makes it more likely in the future, not quite yet. What that might look like is not a presidential system. It's not jumping wholesale into an American system or anything like that. But it might be, for example, changing who is nominated to form a government. One proposal out there is that the largest party automatically gets the sole chance to form a government, and that would lead people necessarily to want to vote for a large party, and therefore eliminating a lot of the small parties and the number of parties. And finally, I won't tread too deeply since we have an ambassador to tell us more about this, but would foreign policy actually be different? And here, a lot of people look at this and they think if just Netanyahu went, some of their, dovish opinions would come to the fore. Israel's fundamental interests and moreover its consensus on some of the issues would not change. And although I think its interests are very different than Netanyahu's on, say, the Palestinian issue, by and large, the consensus in Israel is very hawkish. And that is partly evidenced by the right wing, the strength of the right wing in these elections, although that's warped by Netanyahu. I think it would not be so strong if it had not been for Netanyahu. But on Iran, on the Palestinian issue, more or less, we're going to see mostly continuity, and that is particularly on Iran. Where would you see some differences? You would see some differences depending on who the prime minister is, but you would see some differences in the Palestinian issue. If it were Gideon Sa'ar or Naftali Bennett, which could happen, especially Bennett, you would see a significantly more hawkish position or more ideologically right-wing position. If it were Lapid, you would see something that is not terribly distant from Netanyahu, but one that at least sees a long-term difference. And you would see something different on kind of very vague notion of values, where Yair Lapid, for example, could find himself rather in some camaraderie, say, with a Democratic president in Washington, something that's a bit harder for Netanyahu. But all this is mostly marginalia. You would see a lot of continuity. Why don't I stop there?
Tom, before we leave you, can you remind our listeners and viewers about what the major electoral reform was during the 1990s and why it was abandoned after it was adopted?
Certainly. So Israel has a parliamentary system, which is very common in the world. That's more common than presidential systems. What is rather unique about Israel it's probably rather unique is the wrong phrase, but it's almost unique, is that it has a very proportional representation system, meaning that if you get a quarter of the votes, you get a quarter of the seats, almost perfectly. That used to be even more perfect than it is today. The result of that is a very large number of parties. So to fix part of the problems that come with that kind of system, in the 1990s, they passed a law for direct election of the prime minister. The voters voted with in two different ballots, one for the prime minister. In the first round, it was Netanyahu versus Shimon Peres, the incumbent then, and this was Netanyahu's first victory. And in the second ballot, they voted for parties. It was then determined, I think probably erroneously, but it was then, at least the perception is, that this strengthened the weaker parties rather than weakening them, because it allowed people to vote for the prime minister, but then also to give another vote to a small party rather than having to vote for the big party to determine prime minister. That's why it was abandoned, and it was abandoned in the end by Ariel Sharon, who reverted almost exactly to the old system with some important changes. The most important one was raising the minimum threshold to get into the Knesset, which has since been raised again, in no small part to try and mess with the Arab parties that were always very close to it.
Daniel, let me turn it over to you to conclude.
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. Look, elections are consequential, perhaps the most consequential single act that people in democracy perform. Prime Minister Sharon used to tell me that Israel is a democracy among democracies, almost like a small town hall system. But elections are consequential if people use the occasion to think through the core issues that divide the society and think about ways in which their vote can make a difference. What we've seen now in these 4 elections is that almost nothing changes. Sure, a couple of votes moved from one party to another. The big center party from the last election, blue-white, essentially collapsed. It still exists, but it lost a significant amount of its support. But its voters largely went to other center parties. And that suggests that we may be looking at the divisions among Israelis in a way that doesn't tell the whole story. On the one hand, President Rivlin, the president of the State of Israel, has said that it's a society comprised of tribes. And he has divided that society along ethnic origins and so forth. I tend to look at it the way a taxi cab driver once told me in the midst of the housing crisis that Israel was suffering some years ago. And I knew this taxi driver from previously, and he was a far right-wing Likud voter. But he started complaining to me on a ride to Ben Gurion Airport about how a government could possibly provide money for settlements and not provide housing for young people. And so I said to him, Shmulik, does that mean you're going to vote for somebody other than Likud? And he said, no, of course not. He said, Likud's my team. I root for Beitar Jerusalem, the football team in Jerusalem, and I vote for Likud. In other words, it didn't make a difference whether or not the government was performing the way he preferred, but rather he felt an affiliation and identification and a kind of loyalty to the party. And I think that's what accounts for much of the problem in the electoral process in Israel. People are voting for lots of different reasons, but at the end of the day, when they submit their ballot, they're voting for a kind of team. People on the left will vote for labor or merits. People in the center have a couple of choices. People on the right have several choices. And people who are ultra-Orthodox or from the Arab community have several choices. But essentially, the makeup of the league hasn't changed at all. And in one respect, I think that accounts for why this election is not as consequential for the United States as it might have been. Had there been a possibility, or had the reality occurred where significant change took place, if Likud had dropped even more than 20%, if the left had gained more than it gained, I think Washington would have paid attention. But we're now dealing with an administration, the administration of President Biden, that has almost consciously downgraded its level of interest in what happens in Israel. It hasn't downgraded the relationship. For Biden, as for all politicians in Washington, The Israeli relationship is quite important, and you'll hear that constantly. But the fact is that there are no expectations, I believe, on the part of the Biden administration that Israel will change its approach on the three critical issues where there are fundamental disagreements between us. We already talked about the question of the Palestine issue. Almost no matter what government comes into office, there will be little change in Israeli policy vis-a-vis the future of the occupied territories, the question of self-determination for Palestinians, and how Palestinians organize themselves into the possibility of a future state. The second big question, of course, is Iran. Now, remember that Joe Biden served as vice president for 8 years in an administration which had perhaps the most fraught relations with Israel that we've seen in the past 25, 30 years. And a large part of that had to do, number one, with the settlements question, but number two, with Iran. And so the possibility of Israeli change of policy on Iran, I think, is rather small. And we've already seen this administration quite anxious to go back into some variation or some form of the Iran nuclear deal, which had caused Netanyahu such heartburn before. But there's a third issue on the horizon, an international issue, and that is China. China in the Middle East and China vis-a-vis Israel. The United States and China are in a now prolonged period of cooperation, conflict, competition, and that needs to be sorted out. Israel wants to maximize its national interests and has invited China to do a number of things that are quite disturbing to the United States. There was the possibility of China getting a large contract to run the Haifa port. There's a report, I think it's in today's newspaper, that suggests that China is doing some things with the Israeli Defense Forces that's going to be very disturbing to the United States military. So China, which seems to be far away from this conflict and has never played a very significant role, is now interested in Israel because of the technology and because of a foothold that it can gain. And I think it'll be increasingly at odds with the United States. With Israel, the United States will be increasingly at odds with respect to China. So on the one hand, this is a non-consequential election for the United States because it doesn't portend much change in the dynamics of Israeli power. But those three issues are not going to go away, and therefore the road ahead could be very, very rocky.
Thanks. It is in three phenomenal presentations. It is intriguing, since governing is about choosing and setting priorities, that the administration has willfully decided not to confront the Israelis in an Obama-like fashion on both Iran and the Palestinian issue at the same time. In fact, far from being in a hurry to get back into the JCPOA, the Israelis are telling the administration, what's the hurry? No more cartoon bomb pictures displayed by the prime minister at the UN. Iran may be 2 years away, assuming they even have decided to develop a weapon. And the Biden administration, I'm not sure, has a whole lot of urgency. It's clearly not on the Palestinian issue, and I'm not entirely sure that domestic politics here won't determine to a large extent how quickly they want to rush back into an unpopular agreement for which there's no constituency in the United States. Zero, except among progressive Democrats, maybe. Great presentation. So let me start with my annoying questions. The first is the foundational question. And I know we could spend another hour and a half on it, but I would like each of your impressions. Dahlia, I'm going to start with you. Why is Israel a highly functional democracy, despite all of its imperfections and problems, confronting the very real possibility of a fifth election in a little more than 2 years? Why?
I want to take issue with the idea that Israel is a highly functioning democracy. I mean, without going into the entire history of Israeli democracy, there is a strong argument to be made that it's not just about some flaws. Since its founding, Israel has been holding some portion of people under its control under martial law. And I think that that's not just a side point. In other words, if you look at the ideological divisions that we talked about, and I don't truly disagree with Natan on your analysis either. I didn't want to neutralize the Netanyahu factor. But the ideological divisions I talked about, like I said, the very first and biggest one is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the third one that I mentioned, not to skip over the middle one, religion and state, but the third one I mentioned has to do with the role of the judiciary. And the role of the judiciary is not just about saving Netanyahu. It is about undermining the independence of the judiciary so that the judiciary cannot place any constraint on executive decisions, and the legislature as well, of course. And that is going to, that serves two purposes. One is Netanyahu's personal kind of effort to undermine the legitimacy of the proceedings against him. But the attacks on the judiciary far predate Netanyahu. They go back at least a decade. Actually, they really go back to the early 90s, but they really picked up momentum in Israel because there is a significant ideological factor behind them. One comes from the ultra-Orthodox, who want to maintain a sort of autonomous status in Israeli society. But the other comes, and I think we've seen the real push behind the assault on the Israeli judiciary from the national religious community, from their parties. The party that has taken the lead on trying to place greater political control over judicial appointments, on trying to pass a law that the legislature can override the judiciary, is Naftali Bennett's party. And that was when Ayelet Shaked, his partner as leader of the party, was justice minister. That's partly because they want an unfettered hand to continue expanding Israel's control over the West Bank without demands for civil rights, with less ability for the court to hear petitions for violations of human rights, basically to take away the kinds of powers the court has asserted for itself. Okay, I don't want to misrepresent the situation here. As we know, Israel doesn't have a constitution, so these powers were not clearly defined beforehand. They have been evolving over the years. But I think you cannot separate this divisive issue of the role of the Israeli judiciary from Israel's, really kind of split personality ideas about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its endgame with relation to the West Bank and Gaza. Let's not leave out Gaza. Until Israel makes a decision about that, it needs the maximum possible space for maneuver without checks and balances at home. Okay, now, you want me to bring this back to elections, but these are the issues. These are the issues that are, but these are the issues where, if I can disagree with one other, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Natan or Dan, I think it was Natan who said there wouldn't be that much differences of policy on certain issues. I think where you would see a difference of policy on elections, if there's a government that doesn't have Netanyahu, depending on who would be prime minister, is, for example, if Lapid is prime minister versus Naftali Bennett, which is not impossible, is prime minister, you're going to see a major difference on how the next government deals with the judiciary. And that's going to be one of the fundamental issues on which they will not agree if they try to form a government together. And if they can't form a government together, we will be going into a fifth election.
All right, but let me push on this. A counterfactual. If Benjamin Netanyahu were not under indictment on bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, would we be where we are today? And this is a critically important point. Would Israel be facing a fifth election in 2+ years? Isn't that the simplest explanation? A prime minister who needs to be in power, who our mutual friend Anshel Pfeffer says wants it more, is prepared to do anything to get it, and is simply more determined because he needs to stay in power and he needs to prevent anyone else from gaining power. Is it too simple of an explanation? It seems right to me.
Well, I think the legal case is too simple an explanation. Netanyahu was a killer instinct politician long before the indictments. The April elections happened. He had not yet been indicted. He was under investigation. We knew the indictments were coming. So people had factored all of that in, but the indictments hadn't actually happened yet. If you're trying to pin it on the indictments, I don't think that's the case. Of course, in April 2019, the reason we couldn't form a government is because Avigdor Lieberman made the surprise move of pulling out, and not for reasons related to his corruption. We knew the indictments were coming. He pulled out because of his criticism over Netanyahu's handling of one of those three core issues, religion and state. Theoretically, right? You could also say it's internal politics and ego and a desire to take Netanyahu down because he had been around too long or whatever. We all became, at any given point, we are all psychoanalysts of some Israeli political leader. And at that moment, we were all psychoanalysts for Lieberman. But his stated reason was that Netanyahu wasn't willing to go far enough on drafting the ultra-Orthodox. It had nothing to do, by his stated rhetoric with the corruption. And even Gideon Sa'ar, theoretically maybe used kind of said, well, we shouldn't have a leader who's under 3 counts of indictment, and that's why I'm breaking away. But he didn't change the political map almost at all. In fact, after Gideon Sa'ar established his party, you had the closest of the 3 elections to the previous one. Because the blocks only changed by 58 to 59 for Netanyahu.
Okay. Natan or Dan, do you want to take a minute to address this? It's complicated.
Yeah, let me jump in, and I'll quote Dahlia from something she said the other day, not today. She gave an example how Naftali Bennett ran a campaign almost entirely devoted to an economic program, but nobody paid attention to it. And it goes back to the point I made earlier. In some respects, Netanyahu is the fading Hall of Fame star. He still, motivates people because he's the captain of the team, but he's motivating them less. And I think it's not only because of the indictment. I would attribute it also, as we saw in the United States, to his handling of COVID and the shutdowns and the way different people reacted to it. On the one hand, did not do apparently a very good job at various stages, did a great job at other stages. It was a little bit of a roller coaster, at least watching it from a distance. Dahlia can fill us in better. But I think that's what we're facing is a question of, the old slugger who, people say, well, we're loyal and therefore we're going to give him 30 seats, but without a lot of enthusiasm. And there isn't an up and coming, Derek Jeter or Mariano Rivera out there that people can wrap their arms around. Aaron and I, by the way, discuss baseball all the time. So this is a familiar part of our discussion. The point being that, if there is a 5th election, what is it that's going to change the perspective of the Israeli electorate? And I just don't see anything changing it unless Netanyahu is removed by virtue not just of the indictment, but of a conviction. Right. And then my guess is that Likud's numbers do take a significant dip. It's still the team, but without the aging star, people will be looking for the next star, whether it's Bennett or Lapid or whoever, to wrap their arms around. And I think that's the unfortunate reality of that system. That again, I think, as both Dahlia and Natan said, the election is not only about Netanyahu, but it is partly about Netanyahu, and that partly accounts for the stalemate in large part.
Well, the trial, I gather, it should be an interesting split screen. Is it next week or the week after? The Knesset is sworn in on the 6th, and the evidentiary portion of the Prime Minister's trial is on the 6th as well. It would be an interesting split screen. Natan, let's do a best and a worst. What is the good news in your mind that came out of this election? I think there is some good news. What do you think it is?
I think there is good news. It's a bit hard to find it in sort of this Groundhog Day. I'll say it's an odd good news, but I think it is one. One of the most interesting things that happened in this round is that Netanyahu, for political reasons, decided to court the Arab Israeli vote. So Palestinian citizens of Israel were about 1/5 of the population. And Netanyahu may be learning from Trump and saying, you know what? If African Americans vote so overwhelmingly for Democrats, I just need to shave off a little bit of the vote and I can actually have some success there. And certainly among Latino voters in certain parts of the country. And he decided to change his tune, which was very bellicose towards them in the past and in recent past. And moreover, courting one part of the Joint Arab List, 1/4 of the Joint Arab List, the southern branch of the Israeli Islamic Party. So basically a Muslim Brotherhood type kind of party, but certainly the much more moderate, I guess is the word, for half of it. And that was successful in the sense that first Likud got more votes in the Arab sector. It's not an enormous amount of votes, but it certainly got more votes. It's, by the way, the largest portion of the quote-unquote Jewish parties, or the predominantly Jewish parties, the Likud got the biggest. It's also, of course, the biggest party. That's after the Arab list. And secondly, it managed, this Islamic party did manage to get in, breaking away from the joint list and running alone. It did come in, and it came in with a clear statement that it does not endorse anyone yet for prime minister, that it would indeed deal with Netanyahu and it might recommend Netanyahu as prime minister, depending on what you give me. With the argument being that those on the right and those on the left always ignore us, always refuse to join us in coalition, don't help us, and they don't solve the Palestinian conflict anyway. So why should we not deal with whoever is the winner and see what we can get for our own constituents? Now, many people are very angry at that, but I think there's also a very important upside to that, which is that a fifth of the population, which is largely marginalized politically, can now become more of a political player in ways that I like or don't like, that doesn't matter, and is one that needs to now be courted by all sorts of different factions. And moreover, there's slightly more cover for different parties among the quote-unquote Jewish parties to say, we can deal with them, because if Benjamin Netanyahu can deal with the Islamists, why can't I?
I mean, it would be an important metric in terms of the issue of integration.
It could, and I think it's also a symptom of it. I mean, it's also the fact that there are a lot of Palestinian voters, Palestinian citizens of Israel or Arab Israelis who, of course, care about the Palestinian issue, but also care about a whole host of other issues that real people in a real society care about. And they're in a very difficult dilemma, of course, but I think there is something healthy about this. There was something healthy about a joint list that gave agency and power, but there was also something very unhealthy about the fact that communists and Islamists were bunched together. Why? Because they're Arab. And instead, if you have communists and Islamists disagreeing fundamentally, for example, about LGBTQ issues, which were central point of the contention, a very divisive issue, that is more healthy, even if I don't like some of the rhetoric.
Right. Okay. I have my candidate for the worst conceivable news to emerge from this election, but I'll let Dahlia and Dan each have a quick take on their favorite candidate for the absolute worst result of Israel's fourth election in two plus years. Dahlia?
The candidate for the worst. Wait, is the question is who had the worst result?
No. What is the worst outcome of all the various dimensions?
Oh, that's easy.
Arabs, the return of Gantz got 8 seats. The return of Meretz under Merav Michaeli did very well. That sort of thing.
Labor under Merav Michaeli. You certainly, just to correct, Merav Michaeli is the head of the Labor Party, and that's I think a pretty good result for Labor. To my mind, there's very little competition for what was the worst outcome. The worst outcome is that Netanyahu midwifed the birth of the National Religious Party, religious Zionism, and which is actually quite unfair because religious Zionism is a description of how many people consider their religious identity, and many of those people, at least on an anecdotal level, I haven't polled on this yet, are very upset about this party now claiming to represent them, which is basically full of Jewish supremacists, proteges of Meir Kahane, homophobes, and the kind of people who have been, who should be anathema in any democracy. This is should be an issue that's beyond left and right. These are flat out extremists, and they were not crossing the threshold when they had run separately in previous elections. Netanyahu, did everything he could to make them merge together as a party and then openly encourage voters to support them. It's probably one of the reasons his party lost 6 seats. I'm not saying all 6 went to them. My guess is maybe half of those 6 seats went to religious Zionism and half of them went to Gideon Sa'ar. But the fact is that if Netanyahu is able to establish the next government, and remember, I went into this cycle just ahead of the election thinking that was the more likely option, 40%, 30-30. It will be with that party. They will not just be sort of, raising heckles from backbenches of the Knesset. They will be in the executive power. The other ironic thing about it is that while I'm as pleased as anybody that the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel have a more key role, are being taken more seriously as part of the political kind of negotiations in Israel and have more bargaining power, 2 things about that. One, it did not start with Netanyahu. There's no question that Netanyahu put it on the map for the more mainstream and right-leaning voters of the country to take the idea more seriously and legitimize it. I'm seeing the change in surveys already. But it started with Ayman Odeh back in 2015, who made Jewish-Arab partnership part of his political identity, advanced the idea of recommending Benny Gantz to be prime minister, recommended him to the president after the May 2020 elections, further putting the idea on the agenda. And it was almost like Netanyahu was a latecomer who said, hey, if they're getting in on that, I want to get in on that too. So I do want to put that out there. But if it should come to pass that Ra'am, the party representing the Islamic movement in Israel, would help Netanyahu establish a government, it would be a bittersweet, not even sweet, it would be rather a bitter victory for a very, urgent cause that I agree with, which is bringing an Arab party into the governing coalition. But if it were to happen in a way that a theocratic, illiberal Islamic party helps to establish a theocratic, illiberal, extremist party that is dominated by the far right-wing Jewish parties, that's not a great outcome either. Fortunately, I don't really think it's going to happen.
But on April 6th, the 6 seats that belong to religious is it 6, Dahlia?
Yes.
Will be seated in the Knesset.
Yes, they will be in the Knesset.
Posing an epic moral hazard. And albatross is the wrong, I'm not sure that's the correct word. I mean, with all due respect to albatrosses.
I agree with you.
The Israeli Knesset, the state of Israel, now has to deal with a overt manifestation of a homophobic, anti-Arab, racist block of parties that call for the expulsion of Arabs, assuming they don't pass the loyalty test. I mean, it's extraordinary to me, but maybe I'm out of touch with something. Daniel, I know you wanted to add.
Yeah, I just want to second what Dahlia and you have just said. The legitimization of a rancid, horrible Kahanist ideology is a genie that's not going to be easily put back into the bottle. And I think Israel's going to have to cope with this for some time to come, almost regardless of where a 5th or 6th election takes us. And it does recall something that Dahlia said earlier when she questioned Israel as a full-blown democracy.
I said functional democracy.
There was a book some years ago, Gadi Taub, called The Settlers, in which he did a really deep dive into the ideology, viewpoint, actions of settlers, and came out with an astounding finding, which was that many of the settlers, when faced with the choice between Israel as a democracy and Israel as a Jewish state, were ready to dump democracy overboard. Now, the reason that's relevant is because I've always tended to see the future of Israel as a kind of Venn diagram, where you have democracy in one circle and Jewish state in another. Those are two parts of basic laws in Israel. And the third part is the future of the occupied territories. Well, if you choose a Jewish state and holding on to the occupied territories, you run into a huge problem, which the former prime minister and defense minister of Israel called apartheid. There's very few on that side of the political spectrum who would argue to give full rights to Palestinians while holding on to all of the land. And so therefore, if you don't give full rights to all the Palestinians while holding on to the land, you have a very significant attack on the democracy that Israelis believe that they hold so dearly. So it's not just the particular members of religious Zionism, all of whom are odious individuals, and they should be in jail, not sitting in the Knesset. But it's what they represent, and now they're part of the public square, and I think that's an extraordinarily difficult problem that Israel's going to have looking ahead.
Natan, did you want to add something?
So I cannot agree strongly enough about the Kahanists, and particularly Tamar Ben-Gvir, who's now entered via this sort of oddly named religious Zionism. He has no room in polite society, certainly, but definitely not in the Knesset. One thing is that Netanyahu holds a lot of personal responsibility for this, and I think it's a symptom of the distance which he'll go that Anshel Pfeffer spoke about. He really did orchestrate this, as evidenced by the fact that there's actually a 7th member of religious Zionism who entered via the Likud list. So the Likud gave the 28th seat by the authority of the chairman of the Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu. The 28th seat in the Likud is actually a member of religious Zionism, and that seat will be given. So they actually have 7 members. But I'll just want a caveat, which is that only Itamar Ben-Gvir is of that faction of the Kahanists. There's another one who is from another party which is almost solely homophobic. That's kind of its only platform. The rest are extreme right-wingers, and I have zero love for say, Smotrich, the leader of the list. He's not quite Kahanist. There is, I think those shades do matter. In particular, when we're talking about Kahana, he's not, or Kahana or successors like Ben-Gvir, who's not right-wing. He's simply racist, beyond the pale, something is not even in part of this spectrum. So there's an enormous problem there. It lessens dramatically if Netanyahu is not forming that government, because had he been forming a 61 coalition, depending on actually the vote of Itamar Ben-Gvir, would be in a different story. It looks like he's not, because so as to do that, he would probably need the Islamic Party or defectors from the Change Bloc, and the Islamic Party plus Ben-Gvir doesn't work very well.
Yeah. We have a question from Finley who asks, it's actually an intriguing question, who asks on YouTube, what are the three biggest external factors? I'm editing here, assuming there are no internal factors. What are the three biggest external factors that could somehow change what Finley describes as the stuck political dynamics of Israeli domestic politics? Why don't you each, if you can, or if you want, identify one factor externally that could shake things up? I think Dan more or less took the United States out of the game here with respect to.
I have three.
Excellent.
And they've all happened. One is that if Donald Trump loses the election, if there's a global pandemic that upends the way Israelis live, and the third is if major Arab countries break with decades of precedent and sign normalization agreements with Israel, not just pro forma, but actually say they want to have real good relations with Israel, like the UAE did, which could lead you to two conclusions. Since all of that happened in the past year, could lead you to two conclusions. One is it doesn't matter, and in partly I think that's true. I think we should add one more point to the previous conversation about why we have third elections. It's not just that Netanyahu is under indictment; he's doing whatever he wants. He has an amazing hold, a very impressive hold among his public. And it's for a variety of different reasons, some of them populist and the extremes to which he will go to, but also because he is perceived widely, including by many people who oppose him, as an extremely able politician. So there is something, not just politician, and leader too. So there is something Trumpist about him, certainly in a lot of the populism, but he is also the one who was able to, for example, bring, from his perspective, all the successes of the Trump years for Israel, including the Abraham Accords, et cetera, and to go to war much less than many other prime ministers, especially from the left and the center, and is perceived as a very successful leader, even by some who don't like him. By those who do like him, he's perceived now, especially, as more than that, as a symbol, as almost a manifestation of their own identity. And a lot of his support has to do, I think Dan spoke to this, about our team. It's really very deeply rooted. So I'm from Jerusalem. Beitar Jerusalem is a identity issue in Jerusalem, and Benjamin Netanyahu is now too. Bibi Netanyahu is a symbol of a team, and it's a tribe, and it's very important. I don't mean that in a denigrating way, because Israel's full of all sorts of tribes. This is one of them. So you could take those three things that already happened, the external factors, and say, well, then nothing will matter. There's another possibility, and I think it's possible, which is that a lot of these things have a delayed effect. The fact that Netanyahu can no longer point to his best friend in the White House who will do anything he says, even jumping out of the JCPOA, or Jerusalem or the Golan or a million other things. And the fact that the COVID pandemic, despite the very successful vaccination, has been a huge toll. And all this can have real effects over time. It's very hard to predict. Of course, the Abraham Accords could have the opposite effect, but it's not impossible that it would still come to bear.
Dahlia, did you have an external factor you'd like to identify?
I can try to identify one or two, but it's very hard to find new ones because of the reasons you said. I do want to address just a couple of quick things that, responding to earlier points. Natan's point about Itamar Ben-Gvir being the only one of that Kahanist faction, I just think that we shouldn't minimize the danger that Bezalel Smotrich poses. He's the leader of that party. We know a lot about what he thinks in terms of his political policy because he has been, around in parliament over the last number of years, and he is no less dangerous. He has said things that verge on ethnic incitement that remind me of, the former Yugoslavia. So I think we need to be very careful about him too. And I certainly agree with the Likud voters. Just to say that, let's just remind people that Likud voters do not represent the entire Israeli public. They are, in this election, just about 25% of the population, just under 25%. They have not gone beyond 29% of the population. So yes, they represent something, all of the things you talked about in terms of support for Netanyahu, but that is a minority of Israeli society. Okay. In terms of external factors, I also think it's very hard. We used to talk a lot about, could global pressure on Israel cause Israel to change its policy with relation to the Palestinians? Is there a real threat of what Israeli politicians used to warn about, a diplomatic tsunami? Will all sorts of Western countries begin to boycott Israel, cut ties in any extreme way? I think the answer is no. No, the European countries are not going to do anything that extreme. They will not, implement any boycotts that will actually hit Israel economically, and they won't even implement anything that would hit Israel symbolically, really, beyond tiny little things that Israel exaggerates into, severe insults. And the U.S. won't either. So I think the idea of, that sort of pressure is not going to materialize. And the other, I think, major threat was the accusations of apartheid, which, we have already acknowledged that Israeli politicians themselves have warned of the possibility of an apartheid-like situation. Everyone from the president to former prime ministers, including members of Likud Central Committee, have said it too, that if we pass certain legislation or if we do or don't do certain things, we will get there. There are, significant human rights organizations who are arguing that Israel is already a form of apartheid because the occupation has gone on for so long, it is demonstrably not temporary anymore. And the word has been in the air now ever since Jimmy Carter's book in 2006. I don't think it's really it certainly hasn't rolled back Israel's policy. The one thing that is an unknown for me right now, as a sort of, in my reading of public opinion and the political system, is whether the ICC will have any impact. Because this has been a big issue in Israel during the election campaign. It continues to be on people's minds. I've heard regular people raise it in my focus groups, which is surprising. It means it kind of has filtered down to the average person. And the first thing they're saying is that it shows that Netanyahu is not the king of foreign relations. He is seen as the most skilled politician when it comes to foreign relations. That makes sense. He's been in power for the last 12 years consecutively, and he's undercut the foreign ministry and the foreign ministers. But this is a little bit of a kind of, pulling a weight, pulling down his wonderful rising star of, opening up all these foreign relations all the time. And I can tell you that I don't think it will really restrain Israel or change its policy direction, but I am observing closely how defensive the Israeli establishment is, whether they will try to pass a law that bans or prohibits Israeli civil society from cooperating with any such investigation by providing information, which would be a sign of how scared they are, and whether it becomes, whether Israeli citizens begin to blame the political leadership for bringing Israel to that situation.
I mean, it is interesting. The Biden administration still has Trump sanctions in effect, not only on ICC members, but their families. And it's, again, another intriguing signal of the reality that governing is about choosing. How the Biden administration is going to play the ICC issue, well, I think it's pretty clear. Two final questions. We only have 2 minutes left. The old saw that you can't beat something with nothing seems to really resonate and apply here to why we may have a fifth election and Netanyahu will remain the caretaker government. I mean, Benny Gantz, the Clint Eastwood of Israeli politics, the Rabin of Israeli politics. Is it the sclerotic nature of the Israeli system that has failed to produce we can't answer this in 2 minutes. I just posed the question. Failed to produce a credible alternative, a man or woman of principle, and yet who is in touch with Israeli voters, sensitive to Israeli security needs and requirements, non-ideological, pragmatic, wise, strong leader. I mean, it's getting on now. It's 12 years. And every challenger seems to have failed. Gideon Sa'ar, Benny Gantz, Naftali Bennett, none of them. Netanyahu remains and governs in essence alone, which brings me to my final question. A yes or no will do. I'm not asking you, I am asking you to read Coffee Grinds, Tea Leaves, and Goat Entrails. I want to know an answer. Yes or no will do. No explanation needed. Where will we be in September of 2021? Who wants to go first? Not yes or no. Where are we going to be? One line.
Well, I think there's going to be. I think there's going to be another election. I think the United States will have found a way to re-engage with Iran, which will become a huge factor in the electoral campaign, as much as it wasn't this time around. And much will depend on how the trial goes of Benjamin Netanyahu. If he's around and has come out relatively unscathed, then we may end up kind of where we are. If he departs from the scene, then I think you might see a shakeup of the system, simply because the old fading all-star has gone away.
Right. Natan, where will we be in September?
I'm sorry to say this, but I genuinely don't know. The safe bet is obviously we've had 4 elections, so I'll say a 5th, right? That's the safest, and I think there's a significant chance of that. Obviously, the results are so close and inconclusive. The reason I have pause is that I don't think Netanyahu is going anywhere, but I do think that the quote-unquote change bloc is comprised now of mostly seasoned politicians who are used to cutting deals, who know what their goal is, and understand also their personal interests. And for some of them, a 5th election is not a good idea. For others, maybe yes.
Yep.
And therefore, they might be able to cut a deal where previous leaders like Benny Gantz, who was not a very good politician, he's still around, but he's not central, would not be able to do it. So I'm not completely sure they can pull it off. But if they do, as Dahlia said, it's not long lasting. It's not some new era of Israeli politics. It postpones and changes the crisis.
Great. Dahlia, last word to you.
Okay, I want to just point out that it should be no surprise that it's been very hard for any challenger to challenge Netanyahu. He operates as a classic nationalist, populist leader with authoritarian leanings. I'm not saying he is authoritarian, but I'm saying he uses those tactics. He has, at points during the last 12 years, held 5 ministerial portfolios. He sends his opponents away or marginalizes or diminishes them. He uses divide and conquer strategies. He has weakened the power of civil society and the media and tried to undercut the judiciary. Those are classic tactics that generally result in a leader maintaining power. So it's not a surprise that he doesn't have challengers. Where will we be at the end of this time? I'm going to bet on an unsatisfying, inconclusive caretaker government, either led by Netanyahu or led by the opposition parties, or what they're now calling the Change Coalition, that is cobbled together with spit and chewing gum and maybe a Haredi party, and probably won't last very long. And then we'll have new elections. And by the way, I don't think Netanyahu's trial will have concluded by September of 21. It will be ongoing for years before we know whether he is convicted or not.
Right. Listen, I want to thank all of you. It's been a terrific discussion, incredibly rich. Your authority and experience is just really impressive. And thank you for joining. And one final comment, think positive and test negative. Until next time.
Thank you.